Good afternoon. My name is Jay Brodsky, and we're here in San Diego at the American Society of Anesthesiologists annual meeting. It's October 17th to 10. And I'm here to interview John Kent Garman, a personal hero of mine, for the John Pender History of Anesthesia series. It's particularly an honor for us because both Kent and I worked with John during our time at Stanford. Kent, although you're only a couple of years ahead of me in your anesthesia training, by the time I came to Stanford in 1977, you had already experienced a lifetime of adventures, and we'll get to that. But first I want to know a little about your background. Why don't you tell us where you're from, and particularly about the neighbor who was such a big influence in your anesthetic career.
Well, thanks, Jay, and it is an honor to be here. I have to thank the ASA for honoring me by picking me to do this. It's going to be a lot of fun, I think. I was born in Reading, Pennsylvania, in the Dutch country, and Pennsylvania Dutch country, and we moved subsequently to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And one day I was looking for a job, and I knocked on a neighbor's door and asked him if I could cut his grass, and it happened to be Rick Siker. S-I-K-E-R. Everybody knows Rick. Rick was, as you know, was at one time the president of the ASA, the president of the ABA, and many other honors. Anyway, I got a deep friendship with Rick and his wife Eileen. They are still doing well in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by the way. And I used to go over there and play chess with Rick and cut his grass and babysit his kids. But anyway, Rick then became my second father. And basically, he guided me into my undergraduate education. He guided me into medical school, and he guided me into anesthesia subsequently. It's kind of an interesting story. I would go to his house. He would be sure to introduce me to all the famous anesthesiologists that came to his house. And I made a little list so I didn't forget any of them. William Mushin, Francis Foldis, William Mapleson, Manny Papper, Bill Hamilton, and many other people I actually got to meet at Rick's house. Anyway, so I have to thank Rick for doing that. Rick went to Duke University, and guess where I went to my undergraduate work? I went to Duke University. Rick had something to do with that. And I took a pre-med chemistry major with a minor in philosophy, which I actually really loved the philosophy part of it more than the chemistry part of it. But the interesting thing was, so I'm a pre-med, and in my third year, I got a D in organic chemistry. So I thought, maybe it's time I stop playing around and actually get serious about this. So I went back to summer school and took the course completely over again and got an A+, as a matter of fact. So it didn't completely ruin my pre-medical chances. I graduated from Duke in 1961. So that's pretty much my beginnings, Jay.
Kent, and matter of fact, Dr. Siker, in preparation for this interview, sent an email letting me know how proud he was and how well you deserve this recognition.
Thank you.
Well, after Duke, you attended Temple University's medical school and married your wife, Judy. I've had the pleasure of knowing you and Judy. It's, what, 45 years now? Still going strong? And around that time, you got involved in the Navy. You want to tell us about that?
Yes. This was the Vietnam era, and you either joined the Berry Plan, which meant that you picked a residency ahead of time, so then they would defer you until you finished your residency. But I didn't know what I wanted to do yet. I was not settled on any specialty. So I joined what they called the Ensign 1915 program, and I joined it as a a freshman medical student, and that allowed me to actually to go on active duty for several months every summer vacation. During medical school, I had the opportunity to put a uniform on and do some very interesting things during the summer. I loved medical school. I didn't find it to be that difficult, surprisingly. It was just Temple was a great place to go to medical school. Anyway, one interesting thing that I did is one summer, I think as a junior medical student, I had duty at the air crew survival, cold water survival lab at the Philadelphia Naval Base. So I would go down there in the morning, and it was the summertime in Philadelphia, which is very hot and very humid. I'd go down there, walk into this building, strip down, put on some sort of whatever they wanted to test that day, whatever cold water survival suit they wanted to test, and then they would instrument me for temperature everywhere, and take me into this room that had big fans and a big tub. I mean, this is 30 feet across, full of ice water, seawater, with ice floating in it. And they would put me in there with either just a life vest, or maybe, if I was lucky that day, I'd get to sit in a raft. And I would sit there until I got so cold I couldn't stand it anymore, and then they would take me out. And they would gather data by doing that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. We studied all sorts of survival gear that people would try to survive in cold water. And I can tell you this, none of them worked very well.
So after medical school, you did an internship, a rotating internship in Charlottesville?
Charlottesville, Virginia.
And then you went into active service.
Well, yeah. Yes. I went to Charlottesville. I took a rotating internship at Charlottesville, which was every other night working, and it was an exhausting, old-fashioned internship that taught me an awful lot. I mean, it's amazing. I felt very competent when I left there. My wife became pregnant during that year, and when I left my internship, I actually went on active duty as a lieutenant in the Navy, and I decided, since I had the association with the air crew survival, that I would go to Naval Flight Surgeon School. So I applied and was accepted, and reported for duty in Pensacola, Florida, for a 6-month course in flight surgeon training. This included all sorts of things. We had to go through basic flight training and actually solo a T-34 Navy trainer. My flight instructor was a Marine captain, so I got to kind of like the Marine Corps at this point. He would be behind me with a big yardstick, and I'd have a helmet on, and whenever I was 20 feet off altitude, he would smack me in the head with the yardstick and say, "Garman, I said 2,000 feet, not 2,020 feet. Get on altitude." Smack. And so basically, we did all the survival training. We did a lot of physical training. We actually had a Marine gunnery sergeant teach the whole class, believe it or not, to march and do sword drill, and we got to be pretty good at it. We had uniform inspections every day. So I then, at the end of the training, was allowed to choose a billet. So I said, okay, I'm going to be very smart about this. I will pick an East Coast Marine Corps billet, because there's no way they're going to send an East Coast squadron to Vietnam because it's too far away. Well, I was very wrong about that.
You left out a vignette which I thought was quite funny, and that was about the birth of your first child.
Yes, I don't know how I could forget that. I didn't really forget it, but on the day of graduation, my wife went into labor. It was traditional for the wives to pin wings on their husbands at a very formal ceremony. So I took her to the hospital, dressed up in my high-collar white uniform with sword and white gloves and the whole schmear, and went to the graduation ceremony, got my wings pinned on by one of the other wives in the class, and immediately went to the hospital with this, with this formal white uniform and sword clanking to see my first daughter born that day, and everything. The delivery went smooth as silk. But that's an interesting time.
I guess you were the inspiration for an officer and a gentleman. So after that, you were stationed in Cherry Point, North Carolina. You had your first of a series of involvement with helicopters.
I did that. I reported to this Marine squadron. It was actually one of about 5 A6 intruder squadrons in the country. One squadron had already been sent to Vietnam. When I reported aboard, my Lieutenant Colonel CO said, "Guess what, Doc?" He said, "We're going to have the great honor to be the second A6 intruder squadron into Vietnam." I said, "Oh, great." He said, "And you're going with us." I said, "Fine." So the first thing they did was cut off my Navy tie, buy me a Marine Corps tie, and I wore Marine uniforms for the next couple of years. Anyway, I was flying one day in a helicopter, an H-34 helicopter, with about 10 other people, including the CO, in it down to an outlying field to do some flight training. And the engine just stopped at 800 feet over a pine forest. And we kicked out some big metal boxes that were unsecured in the belly of the helicopter as we were going down. And I remember buckling back in, and then the impact, and didn't remember much more until I woke up out of I was unconscious for a short time, and I woke up with somebody saying, "Get out, get out, it's going to burn, get out, it's going to burn." So I unbuckled, and I happened to be on the up part of the helicopter. I went clunk, and then broke my nose as my face hit the other side of the helicopter, and crawled out, and then didn't walk again for the next 2 weeks because I had compression fractures of L1 and L2. Anyway, that was my first interesting helicopter experience. I will say one other thing. It was expected that all flight surgeons would fly. And after our initial solo 2 flights, we never actually flew solo again. We would always fly as a co-pilot or second seater. But I flew, I was trained into to be a bombardier navigator in the right seat of the A6 intruder, and became decent at it, enough to fly missions. So we can talk about that in a minute.
Well, besides your broken nose and your broken back, you neglected to mention you also had a ruptured spleen. It was a retained rupture, but you still had it. That should be enough to keep anybody out of combat, but it didn't in your case.
Well, the interesting thing was, in those days, we didn't have the imaging that they have these days, and nobody knew I had the ruptured spleen, including myself. And it was a contained rupture. I found out that I had this 3 years ago when I had a nephrectomy done. He said, "Your spleen has been ruptured in the past. When could you have done that?" I said, "Well, that's the only time I've ever had trauma, so I guess that's it." But then we went to Vietnam, and we arrived in Vietnam in March of 1967. And we did a 13-month tour there. Now, why 13 months, you might ask? Well, it's because we were Marines, and the Army did 12-month tours, but the Marines were always better than the Army, so they said, "Well, we'll do 13. If they're doing 12 months, we'll do 13." So that was the deal. In any case, my CO, the Marine CO, called me in one day just after we got there and said, "Doc, He said, my flight surgeon will get an air medal. And I said, of course, standing at attention, aye, aye, sir. To get an air medal, you had to fly 25 combat missions. And of course, I was trained in the right seat of the A6 as a bombardier navigator, so that's what I did. I flew 25 combat missions. Every Marine Corps flight surgeon flew combat missions in Vietnam. And you might ask, people have asked me, well, how could you, isn't there an ethical problem, conundrum there? You're a doctor, and you're killing people by dropping bombs on them. And I thought about this for a little bit, and I said, there's really not an ethical conundrum here, because when I'm acting as a doctor, I do doctor work. When I'm acting as a Marine Corps bombardier navigator, I do bombardier navigator work. They're completely different. They have nothing to do with one. One has nothing to do with the other. And so that's what I did. And that's the way we all approached it. It was wartime, and we had a job to do, so we did it. And the reason we did it, basically, was because if you didn't fly with your squadron, you were not an effective flight surgeon. You were basically a psychiatrist to the squadron. You took care of 300 people all by yourself, and you had to have their trust. And they didn't. If you flew with them, they trusted you. So that's the reason I did it. This was not a completely safe thing to do, by the way. We actually lost, in the 13 months I was there, we lost 3 flight surgeons from various squadrons, killed in action. So.
Kent, I know you're modest, and I do have access to your resume, and I just want to mention that you received 11 citations during your military career, including the Marine Corps Navy Air Medal for your combat missions, the Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal of Valor in combat, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, and 8 other citations, including one for Desert Storm, which we might go to a little later, but you were called up and reactivated for Desert Storm years later.
That's true.
Okay, so while in Vietnam, I guess you decided on anesthesiology as a career, and I'd just like to know what were the factors that led you to make that decision, and how did you apply to a residency when you're stationed in the middle of combat in Asia?
Well, that's an interesting question. While I was there, I would, besides taking care of my squadron, I would go to our evac hospital, which was about 10 miles away, and I would scrub in as a surgeon, usually as a first assistant on big cases, but they would also say, hey, Garman, why don't you debride this guy? You know, he'd have about 100 shrapnel wounds from a mortar going off, so I'd be the primary surgeon on a lot of them. Obviously, I had no anesthesia training, so I was surgically trained, and I noticed the anesthesiologist there was a guy called one of the anesthesiologists his name was Bill Stocker. Well, it so happens that Bill Stocker and I became very good friends, and I talked to him about anesthesiology, and of course I had my previous push from Rick Seiker, so it was in the back of my mind all this time. But I liked Bill a lot, and Bill actually ended up at Stanford in private practice, and he just retired several years ago. Both Jay and I worked with Bill Stocker at Stanford. In any case, that's when I decided I was actually thinking about neurosurgery, ophthalmology, and anesthesiology, and I decided on anesthesiology toward the end of my tour. And I wrote letters. I actually asked Rick Seiker by letter. We didn't have any email in those days. What programs were the best 3 programs? And he said Columbia, Penn, and UCSF. So I applied to all 3 of those programs. Now, Rick told me later that he actually talked to all 3 chairs of those 3 departments and gave me a recommendation, which I was not aware of, but he did do that. And then when I came back, I was allowed to pick a duty station. I picked a West Coast Bay Area duty station in Alameda Naval Air Station. And we spent about a year there. During that time, I had interviews at all 3 places. I went to Penn and was just completely taken by Bob Drips, who just seemed to me to be the perfect person to train under at that time, and so I accepted the program at Penn.
So of course you retired eventually. You remained in the active reserves and eventually retired as a captain in the Navy, which, as you always remind me, is equivalent to a colonel in the Army. And since I never got further than a major in the Army, you for 30 years have reminded me you outranked me.
Well, that's good that I outranked you, actually, Jay. That was it put us on the proper relationship over the years. But you know, let me talk a little bit about anesthesia residency at Penn, because this is very interesting. I actually started my residency in 1969, and in those days, those were the early days of modern anesthesia. We were still using cyclopropane, ether. Some miracle drugs came along like methoxyflurane and ethrain. I remember doing drip inductions with ether, vinethine, and ethyl ether, and all the precautions we had to take about explosive anesthetics. And we had, the whole hospital at Penn had only 4 electrocardiogram machines, and they were the long bullet monitors that were sealed against any gases getting in, so they wouldn't be they were explosion proof basically. They wouldn't set off the cyclo, and they had a little screen about this big with one trace going across. If you had a big case, you had to reserve one of these the night before, and so everybody would say, "Oh boy, you must have a really big case tomorrow. You're going to use an electrocardiogram on this case." And I'd say, "Yeah, it's going to be a big case, yeah." Yeah, but we had no LMAs, and at the beginning, the philosophy at Penn was that you would do a lot of mask anesthetics, and you would become very proficient at dealing with mask airway management before they would let you intubate somebody. So I would go home with my hand like this after a day of sitting there doing 4 or 5 hours of mask anesthesia. And by the way, also smelling of methoxyflurane. My wife would say, "What does that smell?" Well, methoxyflurane, we had no scavenging in those days, so that you would breathe this stuff in, and I think you would get significant levels, and she could smell it when I went home. Anyway, I don't think it was body odor. I think it was methoxyflurane. These were, I really think that this early airway training that they did at Penn was fantastic. I, to this day, say that I can manage any airway with a mask, maybe even better than Jay, or at least as good as Jay.
Now, reading the list of the faculty who were there when you were there as a resident sounds like a who's who in the history of anesthesiology. Who influenced you the most? And you chose to do a fellowship following your residency, which was somewhat unusual perhaps in those days. Do you want to tell us why?
Well, there were some great people there. Bob Drips was number one. Bob Drips was an amazing teacher. The legend was that he would walk into your room and pieces would fall off your anesthesia machine, and everything would go to pot, and you'd have to fix it real quick for Dr. Drips. He would have a weekly session when he'd sit all the residents down in a circle in a big room, and every resident attended those sessions. You never missed one. And he would go around the room sequentially asking questions out of his book. As you know, he had the Basics of Anesthesia book, one of the first texts. And he wouldn't tell us ahead of time what chapter he was going to attack that day, but he would take a chapter and he'd go through and he'd come and ask basic questions out of the book. And so we all were very highly motivated to read this book, and we did. But I found those to be very motivating sessions. There were people there like Steve Provoznik, who ran the operating room, Brett Gucci, who did OB, Harry Wollman, who became chair after Drips, Alan Ominsky was an interesting guy. He did cardiac anesthesia, and he and Harry Wollman were the two people that really got me interested in cardiovascular hemodynamics. And I think Alan, he may not realize that he did this, but he really taught me hemodynamics. And to this day, I think I have a good grasp of the Starling curve just because of Alan Ominsky. But I did take a research fellowship, and I did it with Ted Smith. Everybody knows Ted Smith. He's a respiratory physiologist, basically, an anesthesiologist, and did some interesting things. We studied CO2 response curves and the effects of various drugs on the CO2 response. One interesting thing interesting experience I had with Ted is I was a subject for one of his studies. And in this study, he put an IV in, and he and the fellow, the other fellow, one of my fellow fellows, gave me a paralyzing dose of D-tubocurare. Totally paralyzing dose. I don't remember the exact dose, but 40 milligrams sticks in my head. Could be wrong. But anyway, all I could really do was wiggle my fingers a little bit, and I could breathe using my diaphragm. And what we were trying to do was to see whether muscle relaxants, curare specifically, affected the CO2 response curve. So we did CO2 response curves on me. And the answer was no, it does not affect the CO2 response curve. But it was interesting because at one point, obviously they had my head back like this. At one point I got a little bit like this, and I felt my airway close off. And he said, wiggle your fingers if you have problems. So I started wiggling my fingers. He said, oh, you're having a little problem with your airway, are you? Oh, okay. So then they did that again, and I was fine. But I found that to be anyway, they reversed me at the end of the study, and I went and sat down in the conference about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I became partially paralyzed again. And they had to reverse me a second time, and then somebody drove me home. In the morning when I woke up, my proprioception was all out of whack. That is to say, I would eat my cereal and stick the spoon in my eye, and when I walked, I didn't know where my feet were, and I had to kind of hold on to things. I went in to work. Somebody took me into work, and they said, oh yeah, that's your muscle spindles are still affected by the D-tubocurare. I said, geez, I didn't know it did that. And so they reversed me one more time, and I was fine. My proprioception came back. But I think a lot of people don't really understand that, because when we paralyze patients, we use shorter acting drugs now, and we put them to bed afterwards, and they are not up walking around and doing things. But I think that's a real phenomenon. Anyway, while I was there, I was doing cardiac anesthesia on the faculty with Skip Ellison. Skip and I were the two cardiac anesthesiologists after Harry Wollman became chair. I guess Alan Ominsky was still doing it then too. And we would also run the cardiac ICU. So we were very busy. During that time, Phil Larson became the chair at Stanford. And one day he called me up and said, would you like to come to Stanford and start the cardiac anesthesia program at Stanford? And since we had been in San Francisco at Alameda Naval Air Station, we knew the Bay Area and actually had always in the back of our mind thought that we would like to go back to the San Francisco Bay Area. So this was kind of a fortuitous offer, and I took it.
Well, when you came to Stanford, you got to work with Norman Shumway, who we think, at least at Stanford, is the pioneer of cardiac surgery, certainly transplant surgery. What was it like working with Norm? And I know you were involved very early in the cardiopulmonary transplant program.
Yes, those were interesting times at Stanford. Stanford did not have a real cardiac anesthesia program at that time. Everybody in the faculty kind of would rotate into the heart room. And it was an interesting, I looked for a while and watched how they were doing it, and the chief surgical resident would be in the operating room when they brought the patient into the room, and would actually put in the CVP line and would actually tell whoever was giving the anesthesia what drugs to give. So I looked at this and I thought, well, it's not quite the way we did it at Penn. I think we'll have to change that. So I went to Norm, who was a very, very good guy, a real gentleman, and sat down with Norm and said, Norm, here's the way I'd like to do it. I would like the resident, your chief resident, not to be in the room during the induction and while lines are being placed. We should put the lines in, and we'll do the induction, and I promise you we won't kill your patients. And we talked for a few minutes about that, and he said, okay, that's fine. So the next morning, the chief resident came, and I said, well, Dr. Shumway and I talked, and we both have decided that we're going to do this differently from now on. And you don't have to be here. You can go make rounds or go get a cup of coffee or whatever you want to do, but we'll take care of everything, and we'll call you when we're ready. And he blew his stack. And I said, all you have to do is go talk to Dr. Shumway. And he walked away and never had any trouble after that. So that was the beginning of it. But we had some great people in our group. We formed a group of, we had 5 people. I'm going to read the names because I don't want to forget anybody. We had Rick Fogdahl, Alan Ream, Amira Safwat, Bill New, who actually went on to invent or at least perfect the pulse oximeter, and Mark Hilberman. And they were in the group, and it was a very active group. We did a lot of research. We had fellows. We did actually, Stanford, remember, did the first heart-lung transplant in the world. Mark Hilberman actually gave that anesthetic, as I can recall. I gave the second anesthetic for the second heart-lung transplant. So they were exciting days, to say the least. Chris Mora is now the chair of the chief of cardiac anesthesia at Stanford, doing a great job. But we've had a good run over the years.
Of course, you became a national figure among cardiac anesthesiologists. You were invited to be one of the co-founders of the Association of Cardiac Anesthesiologists in 1972, and I believe you served as the 3rd president of that organization.
Yeah, that was interesting, because what happened was there were only about 50, and we thought there were somewhere between 50 and 100 cardiac anesthesiologists in the country. We could actually list their names because it was the people who were publishing at that time and lecturing, and from the big centers like Mass General and UCSF and Cleveland Clinic and Stanford and Emory and other places. So we got together. I think the people at Mass General were the instigators, and decided to form a group of 50 people, and we membership restricted it, who would sit down once a year and discuss cutting-edge research that we were all doing, and discuss problems that we were having with our programs, our cardiac anesthesia, management of cardiac anesthesia patients. And so we formed this group called the Association of Cardiac Anesthesiologists, and we did, in fact, meet yearly, and they were extremely productive meetings. The organization still exists today. I was the 3rd president. Today, I think it has 100 members. I'm an emeritus member at this time. In any case, I continued to do cardiac anesthesia at Stanford. I was the chief of cardiac anesthesia there until actually 1984, and we can talk about what happened in 1984.
Well, before we get to 1984, why don't we talk about the unique opportunity you had to attend Stanford Business School as part of the anesthesia faculty. You went as a Sloan Fellow. Do you want to tell us why you chose that particular career path?
Yes. Again, I'm a person who likes things. I'm very obsessive compulsive, as are most cardiac anesthesiologists. So I stuck my nose into the management of the operating room because I didn't think it was being done that well, and I became basically the manager of the operating room, or at least the anesthesia part of the operating room. And I found that I really didn't understand income statements. I didn't really have any sense of how to really lead. I didn't understand financial statements, and I got frustrated by this. And I said, "Gee, wouldn't it be nice if I could get a management degree?" So it so happened, Bill New, I think, had actually gone to Stanford Business School as a Sloan Fellow. And I knew about this program. It's a one-year, very intensive, condensed MBA program where you take half your classes with the MBA students in a competitive fashion. You actually had to take exams with them. And the other half were classes that were tailored toward the Sloan Fellows. There were 42 Sloan Fellows in each class. And they told us when we started, don't plan to take any vacations. You're going to be working every weekend, and you're going to be working every night. And they were right. They sent us 4 books. They sent us Basic Economics and Advanced Economics, Basic Accounting and Advanced Accounting, and they were workbooks. And they said, complete these 4 books before you start, or you'll never catch up. So I did that, and it was a very exciting year. And I learned basically that the most important thing in economics is resources are limited. I didn't understand that before. Pretty basic thing, you would think, but that's the reason I did it. And I actually planned when I came back to get more into management at Stanford. Unfortunately, at that time, in the mid-'80s, it was a time of great political turmoil at Stanford. Phil Larson actually left at that time and went to UCLA, and the faculty were very unhappy, and I was unhappy, and we were all economically challenged. So I left in 1984 to go into private practice.
Well, you did leave us, but you didn't go very far. You went right up the road to one of the community hospitals in our area, and within a month you were chief of anesthesia there.
That was an interesting story as well. I got there, and the current chief of anesthesia basically resigned within 2 weeks after I arrived for various reasons, political reasons. And they looked at me, and they knew I had a business degree. And they knew I just came from Stanford, and they said, "You're the chief of anesthesia." I said, "I'm the chief of anesthesia." So I basically was the chief of anesthesia for the next eight years or so, and I also became chief of staff of the hospital for a couple of years, and really enjoyed private practice at the beginning. At the beginning, I said. I actually did it for about 10 years. The problem is, at that time, it was not a very collegial group, and we didn't have a lot of academic or even professional common interests. And what you would end up doing, basically, was sitting in a room by yourself all day doing cases. And at first, this was exciting. I liked the close contact with the patients. I liked doing cases by myself without anybody without having to worry about teaching a resident. But then I found as the time went on that I missed the teaching, and I became deadly bored. After you do something for a certain number of years, perhaps 10 years, you become very good at it, and it becomes boring. I think this happens to all physicians, not just anesthesiologists. And I think you need something else in your life. And I thought what I was missing, basically, was teaching. I was sitting in a Saturday morning, I remember, doing a list of knee cases by myself. And about the 4th case, I was sitting there squeezing the bag, and I said to myself, am I going to do this for the next 15 years? Is this all there is to life? And I said, I don't think so. I said, if I have to do this, I'm going to kill myself. So I went to Stanford the next day. I went to Frank Cernquist, as a matter of fact, who was the acting chair said, "Frank, give me a job." And he said, "Fine." So I went back to Stanford.
Well, before we continue on with your your second Stanford career, it was about the time you started private practice that you began to get involved in the national, state and national organizations. So I was wondering if you'd tell us about your work with the California Society of Anesthesiologists and your work with the American Society of Anesthesiologists.
Well, I have always felt that an anesthesiologist, or any physician for that matter, should give back rather than just take. And I always felt that to be a good citizen, you should become active in organizations that supported other physicians and supported your specialty. So I took it upon myself to become very active in the California Society of Anesthesiologists. I started at the bottom, became a district director, and then I became worked my way up to treasurer, and became the president-elect and the president of the California Society of Anesthesiologists. Of course, with that, you become active as well in the American Society of Anesthesiologists. It just kind of works that way. And I became very active. In fact, I planned to actually run for president of the ASA. And I became very active in committees. In fact, I chaired the what's now called the Quality Improvement and Practice Management Committee for about 6 years. And I was on the EMIT committee, the Electronic Media and Information Technology Committee. I was on the the Disaster Management Committee, the Operating Room Committee, and finally the Art Committee. And I have to say, the Art Committee is an interesting committee that was disbanded just this year for lack of resources. It cost too much to run the art exhibit, and this is the first year, this year, that the ASA has not had an art exhibit, and I'm very sorry about that. I had to be the chair that killed the art exhibit committee.
Well, I know how disappointed that must be, because you, in fact, won first prize in the art exhibit at the ASA on 2 separate occasions for your digital art. So now there's no longer a exhibition. I guess your career in digital art may no longer be recognized. Well,
I'm still an amateur photographer. I still enter contests whenever I can, and it has been a lot of fun. It's one of my hobbies now that I do. But it certainly was nice to have the exhibit, and I think everybody who entered really enjoyed it.
And again, you neglected to mention that you won the California Society of Anesthesiologists Distinguished Service Award as part of the service that you did for our society. So you returned to Stanford and once again became active not only clinically, but in administration of the hospital and various other committees. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, once again, I felt strongly that you should give back. So I did become active in Stanford medical politics, and actually was elected to be the president of the medical staff for a couple of years. I think it was a 2-year stint. That was not that long ago, and really enjoyed that working with the medical staff. I was also asked, by the way, to become a member of the Academy of Anesthesiology, which, for those who don't know, is an organization that basically, once a year you get to go and present papers and travel to interesting places and meet some of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. And I'm still a member. I'm a senior member of that organization today. And actually, I do one other thing too. I'm the webmaster of that organization.
So again, it must be unique in our specialty to have someone who's been the president of the medical staff at both a major university hospital and a large community hospital. So I think that in itself speaks for your abilities. It hasn't been easy, though. Judy had some serious medical problems at a young age, and you've had your medical problems, but it hasn't seemed to slow you down.
Yeah, I should talk about that briefly because my lovely wife, Judy, at age 45, had had a hemispheric stroke from a complete right carotid artery occlusion, internal carotid artery occlusion, which she's basically recovered very nicely from, except she has some side effects from it now. But what it did was, at the time, I really couldn't travel that much, so I decided that I would not pursue the ASA presidency because of the demands that job makes as far as travel goes, and I really couldn't travel at that time. I also this is an interesting story in itself. Three and a half years ago, I was at Stanford working, and one of my good friend actually vascular surgeons came up to me and said, "Hey Kent, we need some normal subjects for a study we're doing." I said, "We'll give you a free MRI if you'd like, to come, and all we want is somebody that has a normal aorta and is over, I think it was over 62 or something." I said, "Sure, gee, well, who would not accept a free MRI?" So I went and had my free MRI, and it came out, and everybody had a long face, and it turns out I had a 7-centimeter renal cell carcinoma, which I had taken out. I had a radical nephrectomy done about a week later, and I've been fine since then. I'm 3.5 years out, and no recurrence, and I had clean margins and no vena cava extension, so I've done well. And I'm actually back, I went back to work very quickly after, I think I took probably a couple of weeks off and went back to work.
In fact, you continued working on Stanford till you were 67, and continued even after you retired as professor emeritus. You would commute. You relocated to the Gold Country in the Sierra foothills and had a several-hour commute to Stanford.
Yeah, as everybody knows, the economy tanked, and everybody's savings tanked, as did mine. I was affected as much as anybody, so I decided I would keep working at Stanford, and they were happy. They seemed to be happy to have me. Every year, I would ask Ron Pearl, who's just the best chair you could actually want to have. I'd ask him, "Ron, am I still okay? Am I working okay?" He'd say, "Oh yeah, you're fine. Keep working." But I would either drive or take the train. It's a 3-hour drive down. I'd go down on a Monday and come back on a Thursday, stay on the campus, and work for 3 days. I worked about 10 days a month, 50%. I did that for about 3 years, and that became very old after a while, and I decided I would stop. I stopped, and I was sitting at home not doing much. And my wife said, "You really should get a job and get out of the house." And I said, "Not a bad idea." So I went to Peter Moore, who's the chair at UC Davis, and I said, "Peter, I'd like a job." He said, "Fine." I said, "Well, I don't want to do nights, weekends, call, no peds, no pain, and no OB." He said, "Okay, that's fine, you can do that." So I work about 6 days a week now, 6 days a month at UC Davis. Great place.
Well, Kent, besides all the many accomplishments we've discussed in this interview, you've done so much work outside of Stanford and outside of anesthesia per se, with public service groups and with volunteerism. Do you want to talk about some of the many organizations that you've been involved in?
Yeah, I would like to. It's, again, I've always believed that sitting around at home is not the thing to do, and so I have done a lot of things. I worked with Interplast, which is an organization that does plastic surgery on children for a number of years. I don't do that anymore, but I went down to South America and Mexico a lot with Don Laub, who formed it in those days. And I'm doing a lot with military organizations like the VFW, the Marine Corps League, the American Legion, with helping homeless veterans and things like that. We're working with the food bank in our area. I also, when I lived in Half Moon Bay before we moved, I actually, after 9/11 and after Katrina, I looked at the medical support in Half Moon Bay, which for those who don't know is an isolated community on the San Mateo coast, west of Stanford, west of Palo Alto, and decided that we really should have an organized medical response if there was an earthquake or a tsunami for that matter. So I went to the fire chief and the police chief, and with their help, I actually was the founding organizer of what's called a Medical Reserve Corps, which is a federal organization that's actually gets federally funded. And I ran that until I left, and that organization is still doing absolutely great. In fact, the city of Half Moon Bay just several months ago gave me an award at one of the city council meetings, which I thought was very nice for doing that. I've also done one other thing too. I became interested in disaster medical assistance, and I joined a DMAT. Now, for those who don't know what a DMAT is, Disaster Medical Assistance Team, and it's a federal team that actually, when you're sent out, you are actually paid as a federal employee, and you have federal liability protections. And we are a uniformed force, but we're not armed, and we take several $1 million worth of equipment with us, including tents, medicines, everything you need to do disaster medicine in an isolated, austere environment. And so I have done a lot of deployments with this medical team, with this federal medical team. I've gone to the Gulf Coast for hurricanes. I've gone to fire. I went to the fire in San Diego. We did that through the California. That was a state deployment. And I went to Guam for the super typhoon just last year, which never hit Guam. But I was one of 12 people at an advance party in Guam to see what sort of support we had to give Guam if the super typhoon hit, which it did not hit. It just skirted the island. And then I went to Haiti. We were boots on the ground. We took about 70 people to Haiti 3 days after the earthquake. And we set up, and that was an absolutely terrible situation. We at first, for 3 days, we had to sleep on the ground with no mosquito nets and no tents. And as you know, the mosquitoes down there have dengue fever. They transmit dengue fever and malaria, and falciparum malaria. And so we were putting a lot of mosquito repellent on, but we were having, when you're sleeping on the ground in a tropical area like that, you have a lot of critters crawling on you at night. And so I found that to be kind of an interesting experience. So we ended up treating actually 2,000 people. And I worked not as an anesthesiologist, but as a trauma surgeon, because we didn't have any anesthesia equipment or anesthesia drugs with us. And so I debrided wounds, I set fractures, I did everything an ER physician would do in an environment like that. And all the wounds were dirty. I had to remember my combat medicine, because every wound had to be opened up and cleaned out, debrided, left open, dressed. We put them on antibiotics and sent them out. And if they were really bad, we had them come back. We had no way to medevac anyone, because all the hospitals filled up within 3 days. The Israelis brought a 200-bed field hospital in a 747, set it up on the at the airport, and within 3 days, every bed was full. And they said, we can't take any more patients. The USS Comfort, the hospital ship, arrived offshore, and they had, I think, something in the 600 to 700 beds. And within 3 or 4 days, they were also filled up, and they said, we can't take any more patients out here. So, we had situations where I would see somebody with a somewhat unstable pelvic fracture, and there was nothing I could do for him except show him how to make one of these tight splints to splint the to splint the pelvis, and I sent them back down the hill to their tent. We were there with the 82nd Airborne. We had 400 troops around us the whole time we were there, and their job was to protect us and to feed and give water to the refugees. And they brought the stuff in with helicopters. So one day we were I was actually at that time carrying supplies into our supply tent from our supply dump to our medical tent, and a H-53 helicopter from the USS Carl Vinson came over and made kind of a very bad approach, came right over the trees, right over our tents at about 30 feet. And for those who know what the CH-53 is, it's called the heavy hauler. It's a very large helicopter that can generate up to 150 knot winds downdraft when it's fully loaded, 120 knots, somewhere in that range. So basically, he came over our tents, knocked down one of our tents, broke some trees off, and I felt myself being lifted up in the air and thrown down on the ground, and then two big 30-pound boxes full of supplies were blown up in the air and landed on top of me and on my back. And when I got up, I realized there was something not right, and spent the rest of a couple more days actually still working. We didn't have any x-ray facilities there, so I couldn't really see, but I was hurting pretty badly, so I got out of there in about 12 days, went home and went to my GP and said, my family practice guy, and said, you know, I think I may have some broken ribs. And he looked, and I had 3 broken ribs. So that was kind of an interesting experience. So my second helicopter, gaggle with a helicopter, I think I better stay away from them.
That would be my advice to you. Kent, also you became very, very interested in technology, and particularly electronics and computers. And I know for someone of your age, it's really the future. And can you tell us why and how you got involved in that? And
well, I'm an early adopter, and I love technology. I love computers. My first exposure to computers was I had one of the first Apple IIs at Stanford, at Penn actually, University of Pennsylvania. And when I was a fellow, we were still doing regression analysis on graph paper, with the tabular paper. You had to do it, write the numbers down, and you had to do it, multiply the columns and all this stuff. I said, that's ridiculous. So I wrote a program for regression, simple regression analysis on a big mainframe computer called the PDP-12, which had tapes that went around, and you had a punch tape to save your programs on, and it was really one of the early computers. But I got very interested in that, and then I've always had the newest computer that comes out. I always buy it. So, and right now I'm still very interested in computers and writing programs and doing web work and internet work and that sort of thing. It's been a lot of fun.
It may be an overly broad question, Kent, but where do you see our specialty going? You've sort of bridged the period from that primitive anesthesia where you had to reserve an EKG machine to a period now where we have so much technology in the operating rooms. What do you see anesthesia?
Well, this is difficult. In some ways, I'm a bit of a pessimist. In other ways, I'm a bit of an optimist. Anesthesia has become so easy compared to when we were doing it, and so safe through our efforts and the technology and the new drugs. I am, for the first time, working with nurse anesthetists at UC Davis. I had a very brief exposure to nurse anesthetists in the Navy during Desert Storm, but that was very brief. This is pretty intense at UC Davis. I work with them every day I work there. I work with at least one nurse anesthetist and one resident. And what I found is there are good nurse anesthetists and there are not so good nurse anesthetists, just like there are good residents and not so good residents. The nurse anesthetists, in general, are very easy to work with, and they seem to be able to do pretty much the stuff I do, the good ones, pretty well. That bothers me a little bit because I've always thought of anesthesia as a physician specialty, not a nurse specialty. I think in some ways it almost demeans the specialty that nurses are doing it. But on the other hand, we don't have enough physicians to do the work, and we need them. And I haven't been able to juggle in my own mind how this is all going to work in the future. The surgeons seem quite happy working with the nurses, and they seem quite happy working with us. We do, however, supervise every nurse at Davis, and I think that's the way it should be. The idea that nurses can give anesthesia by themselves is abhorrent to me. I don't think that's going to be a good thing over the long run, although I don't think we have the data to prove that yet. The residents, I think, the training of the residents is a little different than when I went through my residency, and probably when you went through yours. I do not think they are as good at airway management as we are. It's simply give the propofol, give lidocaine, give propofol, give fentanyl, put the LMA in, and then stand back and look and watch the monitors. I find people watching monitors more than they watch the patient, and that bothers me a lot. And I always tell them, I say, you got to keep your eyes on the patient. And I'll say, how are you able to breathe for the patient with a mask? And instead of looking at the patient and feeling the bag, they'll look at the monitor. Look for a CO2 curve on the monitor. And I'll say, don't look at the monitor, feel the bag, and look at the patient. And they, some residents get this, and others don't. Others just think, oh, he's an old-fashioned anesthesiologist, and he doesn't, you don't really have to look at the patient. You can look at the monitor, and that bothers me a little bit. On the other hand, it has become so easy and so safe, and that's good. I've had a couple general anesthetics, and I felt quite safe having people give me a general anesthetic, and that's great. Where are we going to go from here? I don't know.
We had so many topics to discuss today. I ignored your research. I ignored the review articles and book chapters that you wrote on cardiac anesthesiology, which really made you a nationally known cardiac anesthesiologist. You retired from Stanford as a professor emeritus. We sorely miss you. I can say from personal experience, Kent, that you were one of the best, if not the best, clinician and teacher that we had at Stanford for many years. Your career, I think, can be defined as one of unselfish public service to the community, to your colleagues, to the specialty of anesthesiology. Your CV listed 28 organizations that you were active in. In fact, I believe you were an officer in almost all of them. I think I can honestly say you've been an inspiration to a whole generations of anesthesiologists, including me, youth. And I want to say I'm proud to call you a colleague and a friend.
Jay, that was really nice. Actually, it almost brings tears to my eyes, and I really do appreciate what you said. Thanks for doing this. It was a real honor for me to have you as an interviewer.
And likewise, you have been one of my heroes for all the years I've been at Stanford.